This is the program on constitutional government, and our speaker today is David Azerrad. David Azerrad is, well, you would be a professor of political philosophy if you didn't hold the opinions you hold. but he has a position at the Heritage Foundation, where he is the director of the Kenneth Simon Center for Principles and Politics. He does, at the Heritage he does policy and theory, whether policy for the sake of theory or theory for the sake of policy, let's not ask. His writings have appeared in various publications, most of them with a conservative cast: the Weekly Standard, National Affairs, First Things, the Times of London, that's different, Real Clear Politics, and so on. He's a Canadian, and he graduated from Concordia University in Montreal, and then got his PhD at the University of Dallas, where he wrote a dissertation on the foundations of John Locke's political thought. And he also teaches a course on conservatism or conservative political thought at American University in Washington. Mm-hmm. So, David Azerrad.
Thank you, Harvey.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. Whenever I teach the Declaration of Independence, I always ask my students, what did Jefferson mean when he said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal"? And I can usually bet that regardless of where the students come from, whatever their background is, invariably the answer is going to be some variation on equality of opportunity. Now, I find that amusing because the word equality of opportunity never appears in the Declaration of Independence. It doesn't appear in the Constitution. It doesn't appear anywhere in any of the state constitutions. And if you plow through the voluminous writings of Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton, or any other founder for that matter, nowhere will the term appear. In fact, the term was only coined in the late 19th century. But I think it's a testimony to the power that the idea of equality of opportunity holds over the American mind, that my students, like the rest of us for that matter, understand America, and the founding for that matter, in terms of equality of opportunity. It is, I think, the most cherished term in our political lexicon. I mean, one simple way to verify this is listen to politicians talk about it. They all sound the same. Democrats and Republicans, the script is interchangeable. Even in this election, and I don't think one could say this about many issues, Donald Trump sounds like Hillary Clinton when he talks about equality of opportunity. It's not just the politicians. 95% of Americans agree with the following proposition: everyone in America should have an equal opportunity to get ahead. I think it's very hard to find any other issue on which we're in near universal agreement as a people. Now, part of the reason, of course, that we all love equality of opportunity and all agree with the proposition is that it's an elastic term into which you can pretty much read whatever you want. So equality of opportunity will mean one thing to conservatives, another thing to liberals, and yet another to libertarians. The protean nature of the term basically stems from the fact that it encompasses two distinct ideas. The first one has to do with the availability of opportunities, and the other one with the capacities to seize them, and if you want, convert them into accomplishments. So if we were to use what I consider the awful race of life analogy, and we can talk about that later, why it's a bad idea to think of life as a race, the first realm is going to govern the rules of the race, and then the other dimension is going to look at the training that the runners receive to compete fairly in that race. So if you wanted to equalize opportunities in the first realm, you would eliminate discrimination in hiring and ensure that positions are awarded on the basis of merit. But if you wanted to equalize opportunities in the second realm, you would need to look at the so-called birth lottery to see what is the training that the runners receive in the race. So if you take up, this is why I find this issue interesting, the rather hackneyed idea of equality of opportunity, you're rapidly led to some, I think, profound philosophical questions. In thinking through equality of opportunity, you need to confront the question of how fair is life? How fair should it be? What does life owe us? And when life doesn't meet our expectations, what do we owe one another? And I think this is one of the deepest disagreements you'll find between the left and the right today in America. It doesn't bubble up all the time in our public debates in the public square. We tend to disagree about the size of government and what to do about the economy. But I've found that lurking behind many of these disputes is this question: how equal should opportunities be? Which is the question I propose to discuss with you today. Now, before I address it, I need to take up an objection. If there are any conservatives in the room, surely you will tell me, aha, you claim that everyone agrees about equality of opportunity. That is nonsense. Everyone knows that liberals hate equality of opportunity, and what they really want to do is equality of results. Now, this is one of the most tired talking points on the right. Every single fundraising letter I get from a conservative organization assures me that liberals don't believe in equality of opportunity, and they want to give us equality of results. Now, this is clearly not true if you look at individuals. The left is very concerned with income inequality. I don't know of anyone who is arguing for income equality, who is arguing that everyone should earn the same amount. That said, if you look at groups, and I think one could argue that the left today is as interested, if not more interested, in identity politics and group outcomes than it is in individual autonomy and individual outcomes, this is where this issue of equality of results shows up. Allow me to explain how you get there. So equality of opportunity demands that we award positions in the public and in the private sector based on merit. So the government needs to step in to eliminate discrimination in the areas that are most closely related with getting ahead in life, like college admissions or jobs, to make sure that businesses, employers, and universities are not discriminating. Fair enough, you'll say. But then the left raises a question that I think is quite reasonable. They'll say, okay, but how do you know that in spite of the best anti-discrimination legislation, other forms of covert discrimination don't continue to exist? So Ruth Bader Ginsburg, for example, in her dissent in the Supreme Court decision, Ricci v. DiStefano, said that, look, the Title VII of the '64 Civil Rights Act got rid of overt race-based discrimination, but it didn't usher in, quote, genuinely equal opportunity. More subtle and sometimes unconscious forms of discrimination replaced once undisguised restrictions. So the left asks, I think, this very reasonable question: how do you know that we've eliminated discrimination? And the answer that many of them then offer is a rather simple one. They say, look, when so-called historically marginalized groups are proportionally represented in all of the good areas of life, and then I may add, not overrepresented in the bad areas of life. This, they'll say, is a common sense notion. So if you look at the various identity groups that the left keeps track of, here are women, here are LGBTQs, Hispanics, African Americans. Arab is now a new push, so there's a push to include Arab Americans in the census so we can keep track of them. Here's their distribution in the policy, in the population. When you look at the boardroom, when you look at Congress, when you look at the detention hall, when you look at the prison courtyard, there should be some sort of rough approximation of the percentages of these various groups, both marginalizing and marginalized, in these various areas of life. So the rich, diverse tapestry of American life should be reflected in all of the various areas. So what they're in effect saying is, the way you measure equality of opportunity, the way you determine that you actually do have equality of opportunity for all these groups, is if you see it reflected in outcomes. So it's not embracing equality of results as an end unto itself. It's arguing that equality of results is the true measure of equality of opportunity. It's the only way to prove that you've eliminated discrimination. And then how do you go about doing this? On the whole, the left seems to be more interested in challenging the selection criteria, this will be the selection criteria, by which these various groups are selected, promoted, hired, fired, and admitted. And they'll go about it in one of two ways. One is the rather obvious one of affirmative action. So you basically adjust the selection standards to allow different groups to succeed at different rates. Whatever you may think of that, this approach has one virtue. It makes quite clear what you're doing. The other approach I find is more pernicious, and this is disparate impact. I don't know if you're familiar with the logic. Here the argument is, no, you don't touch the standards. You're not giving different SAT scores for different groups. But here's what you say. If a hiring or selecting method is having a disparate impact on any different group, therefore you challenge the standard, and it is evidence of discrimination. So you don't need any intent to discriminate, and you don't need to apply the selection standard in any different way to different groups. All you need are different outcomes, and this gives you evidence that there is discrimination going on. This is the logic of disparate impact. Let me give you an example. I presume you're familiar with Kaplan Higher Education. This is the group that does prep classes for SATs, LSATs, so on and so forth. A few years ago, they were having a problem with their employees who were stealing financial information of students. So they implemented a credit check on all prospective employees at Kaplan. The idea being, if you're under financial duress yourself, you're perhaps more likely to steal. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission sued Kaplan on the grounds that this policy was having a disparate impact on African Americans. So Kaplan adopted a measure that it applied to all employees, not with an intent to discriminate, but as a business practice, and they were sued because it was having a disparate impact. By the way, as an amusing little tidbit, the EEOC that sued Kaplan itself uses this standard when it's hiring new employees, but it turns out that what's good for the goose isn't good for the gander. Now, I see three major problems with this approach. The first one is that the presupposition that these two things should more or less match one another in terms of statistical representation is a very deeply embedded idea in the American mind. But I think it's a wholly unwarranted presupposition, especially coming from the left. The left tells us that diversity is the most important thing, that we should celebrate the endless ways in which these different communities understand themselves and the rich and vibrant values they have. Why should we expect all Americans to pursue the American dream the same way? Why should we pursue all of these communities to value the same things? Not all opportunities are going to be seized. Not all preferences are alike. That is not to say that statistical disparities are never a sign of discrimination. But when it does occur, I think that we shouldn't immediately jump to a presupposition that it's because of discrimination. Which brings me to my second point. What disparate impact does is it in effect shifts the onus on the private sector to prove that they are not discriminating, rather than to have the government prove that the private sector is discriminating. So we've basically replaced the presumption of innocence with a presumption of discrimination. You end up being liable for any selection standard you use if it's having a disparate impact. I repeat, even if you have no intention to discriminate, and even if you don't discriminate when applying the standard. The only way to defend yourself is you need to say, look, this is in response to an absolute business necessity, and there is no other way to do it that wouldn't lead to a disparate impact. And then lastly, and I think most importantly, the biggest problem with this approach is that when you start to focus so much on group results, in the aims of vindicating the meritocratic principles that purportedly underlie the American dream and the idea of equality of opportunity, you're going to end up awarding positions to some on the basis of skin color, sexual orientation, race, gender, ethnicity, you name it, and then denying others a position on that very principle. So this leads, I think, to a fundamental contradiction. You're trying to vindicate the principle of meritocracy, but then you end up violating it. Either you award positions on the basis of merit, or you don't. Either you don't discriminate either way, or you do. I'm not denying that discrimination never occurs. I'm simply saying that this is not the right way, not a reasonable approach to sniff it out. The other thing I'd like to point out is I'm not so dogmatic as to claim that these statistical disparities are never a sign that something is off. But I think that a more reasonable approach would want to look at them case by case. In certain cases, the explanation might be benign. And then I think that in other cases, when they're not, a proper approach would be, let's leave the standard in place and let's see what we can do to help any given group here that is not meeting that standard. That, by the way, is how the Army does it. And the Army is, I think, arguably the only successfully racially integrated institution in the country. And the Army's approach to dealing with these problems is you don't lower the standards, you elevate the recruits and the soldiers. So the Army has a variety of programs to help disadvantaged youths and racial minorities who are not meeting particular standards to get to join the Army or to be promoted to officer to meet these standards. So that, by way, if this is clear, of disposing of this first accusation that it's not true that all Americans believe in equality of opportunity, because some believe in equality of results. They believe in equality of results by way of vindicating the idea of equality of opportunity. If we now return to this idea of equality of opportunity, I think it's safe to define it. Well, this is not going to work out very well, so I guess I'll draw on the other side. I think for most Americans, the simplest approach would be to say it's a synonym for meritocracy. If you ask people, what do we mean by equality of opportunity? We're basically saying that desirable positions in the public sector and the private sector are awarded on the basis of merit. La carrière est ouverte au talent. That's the way Napoleon put it. So if you're going to award a desirable position, you don't do two things. One is no nepotism. We don't have laws on the books in America against nepotism in the private sector, so you are allowed to hire your idiot son-in-law to be vice president of marketing. Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump have been criticized for many things, but I haven't heard anyone complain about the fact that Chelsea is at the Clinton Foundation and that Trump has most of his sons working as VPs in his company. We don't defend that publicly in America, but I think we kind of tolerate it in the private sector. In the government sector, we don't. There are laws on the books to prevent nepotism. So that's one thing you need to eliminate. The other thing you need to eliminate, obviously, is blatant discrimination. You can't have the equality of opportunity is incompatible with the idea that certain opportunities are not available to certain groups, or that they need to meet a higher threshold to obtain them, or that, look, anybody can apply, but you're never going to give the position to a particular group. Everyone is pretty much on board with that, with one exception. Libertarians and classical liberals, as you may know, don't like anti-discrimination laws. And they say, look, we don't like discrimination, but we think that freedom of association is a more important principle. Richard Epstein is the one, I think, who's most forcefully argued this in a book called Forbidden Grounds, The Case Against Anti-Discrimination Laws. Epstein says, I don't like discrimination, but there are better ways to deal with it. Boycott, shame, put pressure on any institution that is discriminating, but don't meddle with their selection practices because this infringes on freedom of association. They're the only ones who are dissenting. Conservatives, there was a time when they opposed federal anti-discrimination legislation. Goldwater, for example, famously was opposed to the '64 Civil Rights Act. But since then, conservatives have pretty much made their peace with it. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. People come along and they ask the following question. Do we merit our merit? So you want to live in a meritocracy, that's fine. But how do you know that the things that you claim you've merited are truly the result of your own efforts, as opposed to being the luck of the draw? Some people you claim work hard, I think actually they're just lucky. They're born to good parents, they're born handsome, they're born intelligent. They're quite lucky. And then others who fail, it's not really their fault. They're unlucky. This is the way that Ben Bernanke put it to the Princeton grads in 2013 when he was still chairman of the Federal Reserve. He said, a meritocracy is a system in which the people who are the luckiest in their health and genetic endowments, luckiest in terms of family support, encouragement, and probably income, luckiest in their educational and career opportunities, and luckiest in so many other ways difficult to enumerate, these are the folks who reap the largest rewards. End quote. So do you remember you didn't build that? This is, you didn't merit that. You can pride yourself on whatever you want. At the end of the day, careers and positions do not go to those who are most meritorious, but to those who are well-born and luckiest. The goal here seems to be ultimately to completely decouple the circumstances in which you're born, the left calls this the birth lottery, and where you end up in life. President Obama famously said in his second inaugural address, which I think is one of the most astounding statements I've heard. Of course, he said it, I think, with no pernicious intent, and I think most Americans would reflexively agree with it. He said, we are true to our creed when a little girl born into the bleakest poverty knows that she has the same chance to succeed as anyone else. Here you get the redefinition of equality of opportunity as equality of life chances. You're not just saying everyone should have an opportunity to get ahead. You're saying everyone should have the same chance to get ahead. You're not saying anyone should be able to move up. You're saying anyone should be able, the same chances of ending up at the top. They sometimes use the maternity ward analogy, that you should walk into a maternity ward and you should not be able to predict anything about a child's future based on who their parents are. Now, I think that this idea, when you think it through, is quite radical, but I think it appeals to Americans because this is how we think of ourselves, or in my case, a Canadian who aspires to become an American. This is the land of opportunity. This is not the Ancien Regime. Your birth doesn't dictate where you end up. But think it through for 1 second. What would it mean to guarantee that every child in America had the same chance to succeed? The person, I think, who's thought that through in the clearest way is Aldous Huxley. I don't know if you've read or you remember A Brave New World. That's a regime in which you completely eliminate the birth lottery. So if you'll remember, he gives us a world state, so there are no more countries, and all children, are, genetically engineered to have the same genes, of course, across any of the 5 castes. You eliminate the family, and you have a collective upbringing. In this system, the 3 decisive forces that shape where you end up in life are completely equal for all: genes, parents, and upbringing. Now, this, of course, is folly, and no one wants this in America. To state the obvious, we don't have anyone arguing for genetic engineering and eugenics on the left. Rawls, for example, famously says in A Theory of Justice, he says, no one deserves their greater natural capacities, but that's not a reason for taking them away from others. So in a sense, he agrees with Locke that you own yourself, but then of course he'll go on to say, but what you do with your natural talents doesn't really belong to you, and it belongs to the community, and we can redistribute it as is. So they don't touch genes. They don't touch the family either. I mean, occasionally you hear statements in the public square that we should have a more communal approach to child upbringing, but no one is really calling for the abolition of the family. That being said, I think people recognize that that's ground zero for equality of opportunity. That the family is the greatest engine of unequal opportunities known to man. And that's where all the action is. And this is where you see a divergence between the left and the right. And this is the note I want to end on, is to try to give you a sense of how each side broadly thinks about these things. The left recognizes that the family is immensely important. They like to talk about the invisible knapsack of privilege. I presume you've heard of this, that some kids go through life with this invisible knapsack of privilege that their parents have stuffed with all the wonderful things that they've passed on to them. You would think that if they're recognizing the importance of the family, they would be more inclined to try to shore it up. One oddity on the left today is that they're forced to recognize that a good family really matters in terms of equality of opportunity. But then I think their commitment to the sexual revolution and the autonomy of adults really trumps their commitment to equalizing life chances for children. So they kind of back off from trying to push people into having more families. What they end up doing is the following thing: trying to find a way to have the government make up for the unlucky circumstances of your birth. To have, at every stage of your life, some sort of a program that is one way or another trying to give you better odds in the so-called race of life. So if you remember the life of Julia, this was kind of it. At every step, from the womb to the time you're young, early Head Start, Title I funding for low-income schools, there's some sort of a program that is trying to help you catch up with the others due to the fact that you were born into unfortunate circumstances. But that's only going to take you so far, because that's going to be pushing up those who are unlucky. Eventually, you realize that if you want to equalize life chances, you need to start taking away privileges from others. The left calls this opportunity hoarding. And they're saying we need to look at illegitimate methods of privilege transmission between parents and adults. And this is where it gets really kind of kooky. So you will have people like François Hollande, the current president of France, who gave a speech at the Sorbonne a few years ago, in which he said we need to ban homework. The logic is the following: it is not fair that some kids get to go home and their parents help them with the homework, and that others go home to a single mother who barely speaks French. It gives them an extra advantage. Let's eliminate homework. There's a British philosopher whose name now eludes me, who said we should ban private schools because the kids who are lucky enough to go to private school get a leg up on others. The craziest one I've encountered is Matthew Iglesias, who's a progressive pundit in DC. He had a more lethal proposal, although much less fun one, to eliminate these inequalities. He said, let's ban summer vacation. Because some kids get to go to the Amalfi Coast and have these enriching summers, and others are stuck at home all summer rotting in front of the television. By the time they come back in September, some have gone farther ahead than the others. Let's eliminate summer vacation. So for the left, it's a combination of government programs to try to push some up versus thinking of ways to prevent privilege from being transmitted from one generation to the other. On the right, I think the approach is slightly different. I think the right, of course, very much recognizes that there is an opportunity gap in America. But I think the right is less concerned with equalizing, eliminating the opportunity gap than with ensuring that everyone has a certain threshold of opportunity. And what that basically means in practice is two things. The first thing is the right is very big on creating more opportunities. So the right thinks that we have an opportunity deficit in America. So if you want to use the race of life analogy, libertarians and conservatives will say, we need more races. There isn't one race in life, there's a whole bunch of them. And because of cronyism, because of licensing requirements, because of all sorts of cartels that block out people, you prevent people from competing and participating in a whole bunch of realms. So the left is very big on toppling artificial impediments to job creation. That's why the right. That's why they talk about economic growth. And that's why the right is very opposed to any form of licensing requirement that is not reasonable. So the idea that you need a license to be a hairdresser or to be a barber or to be an interior designer. This is a way to keep certain people out. So the way to put it would be, I think the right would say the left wants to level the playing field, the right wants to widen it. That's the first big push. And then on this issue of, well, how do you allow those who were born into bad circumstances to get better odds in life? I think one of the big differences between the left and the right is that the right pays more attention to character than it does to economic factors. There's a tendency, I think, on the left to think that transfer programs can remedy these disparities. And I think that the right's diagnosis is deeper and tends to look at cultural pathologies, the erosion of character. This is Charles Murray's point, basically, in Coming Apart, that what ails the most disadvantaged groups in America is less a lack of material means than certain cultural pathologies, the erosion of the whole, the virtues that go with the American dream. So the right is going to talk a lot about character, a lot about virtue, is going to push marriage more, is going to focus on education reform, of course. That is not to deny, the right doesn't deny that government programs have a role to play in this. I mean, for example, many conservatives in DC are quite fond of the earned income tax credit as a way to help the poor get ahead. But on the whole, the emphasis seems to be more on character rather than economic means. So that in a, I think, somewhat concise nutshell are, as I see, the main differences on this very complicated issue. I would very much like to hear from you. One thing I've really found, and I started working on this issue because as a conservative in DC, you need to start talking about equality of opportunity. I never really thought about it. But I found that the more you dig into it, the more you realize that this is a very complex issue with very far-reaching implications. And I don't think there are any simple, clear-cut positions on it. And I hope that my talk has been somewhat useful in helping you see a little bit more clearly into it. Thank you.
Thank you. If equality of opportunity as a concept or a term didn't come in until so much later, what did the Declaration of Independence mean about inalienable rights and what we now think of as equality of opportunity?
Well, I think the primary meaning is the Lockean one, that no one is by nature a slave and no one is by nature a ruler. So it's a rejection of Aristotle's claim in Book 1 of the Politics, which, mind you, I think if you read the Politics carefully, is more narrow than we recognize it is, that by nature some should rule others, that there are these natural titles to rule. So that's a claim that rule is possible, but it has to be based on the consent of the governed. Remember, the Declaration of Independence is a revolutionary document. It's not a comprehensive statement on political theory. The founders are only marshaling as much political theory as is necessary to vindicate what they're doing, namely the revolution. So they're saying that by nature we have a right to govern ourselves, and this one has been violated. The other meaning is that we all have the same rights. Then, of course, look, the founders, the Constitution forbids titles of nobility, and the Hamiltonian vision is very much of, he's the quintessential self-made man at the time of the founding. I mean, he's the one who pushes the commercial republic, this idea that you can rise. So in that sense, I think you could say that already you see the germ of America as a land of opportunity. But you still don't get this idea of equal opportunity. And this is where the complications arise.
They didn't want to deal with the subject of go any further than that at that point. As you said, this was just a statement of its own. They wanted to put off any more details on who was able to do what with what until the revolution was out of the way.
Lincoln is the one to look at who, so as best as I can tell, the race of life analogy comes from Lincoln. I mean, look, I'm sure someone then will find some obscure pamphlet somewhere that I don't know of, but Lincoln talks about it a few times, but he talks of it in terms of eliminating the artificial weights and roadblocks that are put in front of the runners. So he's looking, if you want, at what happens after you fire the starting gun. And this is where he wants to clear the road and not have the state, discriminate in that way. But you still don't get the intrusions into the private sector, nor do you get the idea that all the runners need to be equally ready to run that race. That comes about much later. Yes, sir.
First of all, I guess I must be in the 5% because I don't believe in the equality of opportunity because it's contradicted by reality. You touched on genetics. You have a person with a 160 IQ and the person with a 70 IQ. I would offer as a contradiction to the left's using the results as a justification for doing something about the opportunity. I'd offer the National Basketball Association. I've never heard a good response from the left to explain why we shouldn't change that so that instead of 20% white, it's 13% black. So, you mentioned Aldous Huxley in Brave New World. In that book, the problem is eliminated by the alpha through epsilon, but of course, Huxley doesn't tell us how he gets there. Kurt Vonnegut, as I recall, at one point, wrote a novel where sort of this to me was always the ultimate embodiment of the left, where there was a tone in the ear, and I think the loudness of the tone.
So it's a short story called Harrison Bergeron that is quite amusing, and that one also shows you what it would take to equalize outcomes in the race of life. So in that world, beautiful people wear a mask so they can't take advantage of their beauty. Strong people are weighed down with heavy weights so they can't take advantage of their strengths. And intelligent people have a buzzer placed in their ear that emits a sharp sound every 20 seconds so they can't form very complex thoughts. And it contains the wonderful line that in the race of life, Harrison Bergeron carried 300 pounds or something like that because he's a very strong man. So that's trying to equalize the genetic component. I think Huxley looks at it more broadly because he then takes in the family and society, which Vonnegut doesn't look at.
I just want to go to, well, thank you. This is so obvious that there's a different level of person, even setting aside the family. It is so obvious that you cannot equalize opportunity except by diminishing the gifted. So obvious to the left that I claim they have a different motivation for what they're doing. It is not that they're really interested in equalizing opportunity, but rather the fundamental predilection of the left, which is to control, to regulate, to have authority over. And you see that's one of the reasons that climate change is such a wonderful issue for them, because everything is related to climate and therefore they get to regulate everything. And I contend these form an excuse for them to have additional government authorities, agencies, regulations, with centers of power that they generally reach, and that is the motivation, and not really anything with equalization of opportunity. And that's why you end up with these, you mentioned 5 groups, they're arbitrary. I could pick any number of groups based on eye color,
Oh, this
hair
was
color.
this was not meant to be an exhaustive list. Look, I don't know what their motivations are. I would rather be generous, and what I tried to show is that you can arrive at this through a rather reasonable chain of reasoning. Meaning, the 2 questions that they pose, I don't think are unreasonable or malicious. One is, how do you know that you've eliminated discrimination? I think that's a reasonable question to ask. And then the other one is, how do we really merit our merit? Now, the answers I think they reach perhaps too hastily. That's what bothers me. But the way they get there, there's a chain of reasoning that I think is somewhat compelling. And you may be right, but you could arrive at these conclusions even if you're animated by good motives.
But that's the point, you see. It makes it sound like they have good motives, when I suspect that their motives are different. You can argue whether they're good or bad.
Yeah.
And they frequently, by the way, take the form of wanting to impose some kind of penalty on us which goes to them. The whole question of reparations, for example. And what are called race hustlers, ways of getting large amounts of money, the Clinton Foundation, ways of getting large amount of money by using political pressure.
Look, that may be the case with some, but my experience has been with kind of your garden variety liberal that populates most big American cities. They haven't thought this through it much, and this is kind of the way they get to it. Perhaps I'll be as cynical as you are along the way, but I think you can...
It's nice to come here and hear generosity. It's a good antidote.
Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Rory Schachter of the government department here. Thanks for your talk. And I'm also Canadian who likes ties, so it's good to have a fellow traveler. I had 2 quick points and then a general question. I guess 2 quick points of disagreement or pushback. First, about the left and genetics. I think that the left's uncomfortable with genetics because of eugenic and genetic legacies, both on continental Europe and also American history, racial genetics, eugenics. So they aren't comfortable with the term, but the technology is sort of here yet now, but it's not yet cheap enough. But it's soon going to be cheap enough. The fact that they're focusing on early childhood education, primary school, preschool, it's inevitable, and I believe they already are working on this. They will want to introduce, using the Affordable Care Act mandates or whatever, have genetic embryonic screening at a highly sophisticated level for all people who want it. And so I think I don't believe that makes. Yeah, I think genetics for the left is no problem, as long as they'll have a new term for it, of course. But especially prenatal, because the people, because it won't, right? There won't be humans who are being messed with. It will. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I agree with you. That I think is a problem that goes well beyond the left and encompasses the whole of our technological modern society. That we have a very hard time saying no to science. If science can do things, I think this seems to be Leon Kass's position, is he kind of despairs at the possibility of us being able to do something, for example, like eliminating death one day, and choosing not to do it on the grounds that it would fundamentally alter what it means to be human. So when science comes to the point where you're able to choose your child, it's not just, I think, the left that is going to go gung-ho. Libertarians will go. I think many people will be drawn to that idea, and it'll be very hard to push back against it.
I taught a course here, or was a teaching assistant for Michael Sandel's wrote a book, The Case Against Perfection, kind of liberal, moderate.
Yeah.
And I can tell you that students aren't all liberals here, but most of them are, or at least in that, and nobody was convinced. I was astonished that they wrote a little paper on it, and nobody agreed. Everyone was perfectly in favor of perfection, especially if their own grades.
Because
so,
we're all moderns.
Yeah, but just one more, and the other thing is about the family. I agree with you that the liberal, whatever, I don't know what, progressive or the liberal, I don't think they really think of themselves as targeting the family, but I would say that in some degree, one could say that their ideological views, certainly of the New Left in the 60s, did target the family. And socialism, as well as fascism, has to target the family. And it did. So it may be that they weakened the family's place in the society so severely that now there's a kind of effort to ameliorate some of the problems. But I think that Julia, that progressive idea, single motherhood, that's already a different idea of the family. It would just be one mother and one child. So I think they don't have to, sometimes I think a war on a specific ideal is better waged by people who don't think of themselves as hostile to it, but rather as
What I meant
no
by
choice.
what I meant by that is, of course, there's a strand of the left that views the family as a repressive, patriarchal, bourgeois institution, and it comes out of the New Left. But the people who talk about equality of opportunity, the wonks in D.C. who focus on upward mobility and all of these things, I don't think that's the view they're pushing. They recognize that intact families are best for the odds of success in life. But my point was only that they don't touch it in the sense of they recoil from embracing a robust pro-family agenda, because then you need to start telling people to do certain things and they're not comfortable with that.
My general question, though, and this relates to a couple of the questions earlier, is that it seems that the Declaration of Independence, it seems to speak a kind of moral equality. And the most obvious problem with equality of opportunity is intellectual inequality. Genetics might be able to overcome that, but even the utopian views of these writers are caste systems, and so there seems to be the idea that there will be some who serve, or not everyone can rule, so it's better to have them inferior, so as they not to, I guess, be as bored being servile. But the question would be then, isn't intellectual equality the fundamental problem with the theory of equality of opportunity, not desperate impact, or that even if all these things work, you'll be left with inequality of intellect, and which will, based on perfect markets, as libertarians would say, would lead to more inequality. I mean, Michael Young in The Rise of the Meritocracy kind of already covers this. I guess it was in the 60s. And you would have these perverse and strange situations, because unlike now, where the poor have a kind of understanding that it's not entirely their fault, and they can make their way, and they can feel some pride in doing that, if there's really truly a level playing field and you're not as intelligent, you kind of deserve to lose. And that's why I raised this issue of the moral equality, that there seems to be this insight that even though there is intellectual inequality, and that people know that, they go to doctors when they're sick, and today we respect scientists and their opinions. Somehow people reserve for themselves, in some strange sense, the idea of their moral equality, meaning that, not that they know how to run other people's lives, but that other people don't really know how to run their lives as well, and they're suspect, because it's not as clear they care about, other people care about you the same way you care about you. And so there's this, and so you have to coordinate this moral equality of sort of vanity, you could say, with intellectual inequality. And that, to me, and I don't think, you said it's Lockean, but it seems to me Locke also is trying to both coordinate and in a way mask this problem. And you get it much more literally in Hobbes, who just says, everyone is equal because they all think they have an equal, amount of prudence.
So the classical liberal understanding of equality, as you point out, is rather limited and is compatible with vast inequalities of natural endowments, birth circumstances, and outcomes in life. The threshold for Locke is, do you possess enough reason to understand the law that governs you? Basically, are you not mentally defective? He calls them lunatics, fools, and idiots, I believe, are the ones who don't get to rule themselves and may be ruled without their consent. So the two categories of people who are not equal are children, who are ruled without their consent all the time, and then people who have some sort of a mental problem. But for Locke, so long as you meet that threshold, you may be considerably less intelligent than someone else, but you're still entitled to that moral equality and to the consent. You're part of the consenting.
Unless you're a natural slave, as you were saying.
Yeah, which I mean, my sense is this Aristotle, I've what's his name? Wayne Ambler wrote a couple of very interesting articles, I think in the 80s, on a very careful reading of Book 1 of the Politics, on what exactly Aristotle meant by the natural slave. And he seemed to suggest that it's really confined to someone like Lenny in Of Mice of Men, who's...
I have a question or comment based on the form of your talk today, presenting the argument as between left and right. Am I correct to think that that's highly unusual, if not unique, way to deal with the question of equality of opportunity? I don't know of any academic argument which actually poses the two sides and tries to restore or make a conflict or disagreement that in a way so that a reader or a listener can compare them. Certainly not. I've never read an article written by a philosophy professor with that form of presentation.
Well, I use it as a pedagogical tool. That when I say left and right, I don't mean every single conservative or libertarian in the country and every last liberal. I mean more the inner logic of their worldviews and the direction they're driving in. So to a certain extent, I'm magnifying, somewhat radicalizing and exaggerating, but I think it's with the view to discern more clearly the directions they're pushing in. And many of them may not go that far because they haven't thought it through or they think that the conclusions are disturbing. But I think it's a useful way to gain clarity on where the disagreements lie. And then it may not be the case with philosophers, but in Washington, D.C., I've lost count of the amount of conferences I've gone to that promise to rebuild an opportunity society and the amount of reports that are published by think tanks claiming that they're going to rebuild opportunity in America. It's a big thing in D.C. You start to notice these fault lines. What is the underlying conception of equality of opportunity that animates their thinking? And where are they investing their efforts in the policy level to fix things? Yes, sir.
So I have, well, first of all, I thought the talk was terrific. Framed the issue maybe for pedagogical purposes, but very successful in that respect. But I had a couple of thoughts about it. One thought was, it seems to me that the left is hypocritical. If you say that this is what they're all about, because they are very carefully safeguarding all the inequalities about which they care a lot for their own. My daughter lives in the heart of New York City, and I see all those baby buggies being hauled around to all these wonderful opportunities that you have only in the heart of New York City. And they all seem very happy with this on their way to the Obama rally, right? So I think there's a huge, you could say, well, maybe that's just the hoi polloi of the left. The really clear thinkers wouldn't be that way, but it seems to me that there's a lot of hypocrisy in that way of thinking about them. But the other thought I had was more, how about, can we save equal opportunity? Do the conservatives have to give up equal opportunity? You made some reference to Lincoln, which you might explore a little bit more, because it seems to me that there is an understanding of equal opportunity which does not at all lead to equality of results, acknowledges great inequalities of character and of resources and of genetic endowment, but everybody should have equal opportunity to do as well as they can with what they have, take away the blocks. And if that's really where Lincoln was, that would be one way of thinking about it. So, I don't know, I'd be curious as to what your
Well, I mean, I think I hinted at various points in the talk what a more limited conception of equality of opportunity would look like. One is it would eliminate all of these artificial roadblocks to opportunity. But the challenge is you can't leave it at that, at least not today in America. I don't think it's a tenable position in the public square to say equality of opportunity only has to do with jobs, college admission, housing, and so on and so forth. And if you're born to a single mother in a broken community, well, tough luck. Because at the end of the day, that's the luck of the draw, and it's not my problem. Some hardline libertarians may say that, but you're cooked in the public square. So the challenge for the right is, how do you not go as far as the left does, but somehow recognize that we need to have something to say to that little girl born into the bleakest poverty that Obama invoked in his second inaugural address? I'm not willing to promise her the same chance to succeed as anyone else. That's folly. But surely I must be able to tell her something. And that's why I think that what the conservatives try to do is, as much as possible, to shore up the family, because that little girl is, the odds of her being born into the bleakest poverty if she has two married parents are actually quite small. And then will be to fix the schools. You know, you talked about the disconnect on the left. I mean, one thing that is unbelievable is their opposition to school choice. I mean, de Blasio was closing charter schools in New York, Mr. Inequality himself. The NAACP last week, I don't know if you heard this, came out against school choice, if you can believe that. Whereas the right has been gung-ho about reforming the education system. And then, you know, this is kind of the Murray argument, is putting pressure on the elites to preach what they practice. So these people you mentioned in New York, they get married, they don't do drugs, they don't play lottery, they defer gratification, they work, they go to church. And for some reason, when they see communities that are not doing these things, they're not comfortable judging them, because that would be the worst thing to do. But by not judging them, you're actually harming them. Because the elites set the tone for the culture, and they have a role to play in, broadly speaking, nudging or pushing people in a certain direction. And this is where I think you've seen a big abdication. That the culture basically doesn't preach the gospel of work and marriage. Occasionally you hear voices here and there, but by and large it doesn't. That, I think, is going to be the conservative response. But the great challenge for conservatives is, I mean, you need to get out there and tell Americans, no, I don't believe that the little girl born into the bleakest poverty should have the same chance to succeed as anybody else. That's a hard thing to tell Americans in the 21st century.
But of course, if you put in all the props that are necessary to give that little girl opportunities, you also create the institutions that destroy the character that Republicans want to encourage. And
Yeah.
that's the dilemma that the conservative faces, is that if you're going to have endless government handouts, cradle to the grave kind of security system, well, then you get, you know, declining labor participation.
Yeah.
And
So this is the conservative challenge. How do you design a welfare state that supports work and family and that doesn't undermine it? I don't think conservatives in DC, at least, most definitely don't reject the idea of a welfare state. But the question is, what kind of a welfare state? How does it work? Yuval Levin has written very nicely about this in National Affairs.
Who?
Yuval Levin.
Oh, right.
He has an essay called Beyond the Welfare State. Alex?
Well, I think the interesting question you raise about merit and, you know, whether it's deserved, obviously leads to philosophical directions that you wouldn't want to employ at DC either. But I think the basic point that's perhaps indisputable is, as you say, people, because of nature and education combined, you know, emerge at 14 or whatever age into the race of life with different advantages and disadvantages. So my daughter's the only 3-year-old in America who's heard of Al-Farabi.
Is that an advantage or a disadvantage?
So the advantages and disadvantages is key, and you know, possibly a reasonable way to look at it would be that, you know, the child born in the deepest poverty, you know, you should aim for her to become him, or to become, say, I don't know, an electrician or a secretary or whatever, and that they should have a reasonable chance of something like that. Whereas those who are fit, for Silicon Valley or the upper echelons of business should, have a reasonable equal chance of that. That would also, of course, serve the public good, which requires all of these different professions. Now, that's a somewhat unfashionable view as well in certain ways.
But she may be fit for Silicon Valley too. I mean, how do you know? Why should she be an electrician? I mean, if she had good schools, she might be pushed in that direction.
But
So-
the single parent disadvantages.
Yeah, I mean, that's very hard to overcome. So the conservative solution is how to prevent it as much as possible from happening. Although in a free society, there are limits to what you can do.
Society has defective people and dysfunctional families.
So then the idea, that's why, think of it more, I think, on the right as, what's the threshold of opportunity we owe anyone? Rather than how can we equalize opportunities? So what do we owe this little girl as a society? And I don't think the answer is the same thing that, say, President Obama's daughters receive from their parents. It's going to be something lower, but it has to be something. And I think that good schools would be a start. I mean, I don't understand why we're not more outraged in this country at the abysmal level of our public education system. I mean, we spend obscene amounts of money on our schools, more per capita than any country in the world except for Denmark. We've tripled per pupil spending since the 60s, and test scores are flat. I mean, can America that sent a man on the moon, are we not capable of ensuring that every kid that comes out of high school is capable of reading, writing, and doing arithmetic? How hard could that be? So we could, I know it's not the loftiest thing that we're not going to send her on the moon or to MIT and she's not going to have the same chance to succeed as anyone else, but can't we deliver the basic promise that this little girl should have access to a decent education? Yeah, it won't be as good as, the neighborhoods that your daughter lives in, sir, because she's not going to have as many books in the home and the adults don't read as much, but surely we could squeeze more out of the schools.
Well, yeah, it's just something like enough to earn a basic income and have a family.
Here's a question about whether people of merit deserve their merit, whether Abraham Lincoln deserved to be Abraham Lincoln, or the opportunity should have been open to many more than simply him. Everyone should have. I mean, that has to do with something with the nature of nature, or whether there are parts of nature that are more valuable than other parts. It seems that the essential argument against deserving your merit is that human beings are by nature equal. And nature, when she gives birth to a Lincoln, is being untrue to her fundamental principle. But you could also ask, why do we deserve to be human beings? Why shouldn't a dog be able to go to Yale, for example? And
Well,
in fact, a bulldog, say. Something like that.
These questions are now starting to be asked. I mean, Peter Singer.
Harvard wants to send it all.
Peter Singer and Martha Nussbaum are big on. I mean, in a sense, it's. I mean, the fact that you're a human being is also equally arbitrary. So why should we not help
so
animals
the
more?
premise of that is that nature consists of equally arbitrary pieces.
Yeah.
No one of which is a part more valuable than any other part.
Yeah. I think underlying this argument, if you take the hardline Ben Bernanke position, right, everything is luck, you're in effect denying divine providence. You're saying that it's all mindless matter in motion and that nothing happens for a reason. The fact that you were born to your parents at a particular time in a particular place has no significance whatsoever. Now, there is an internal consistency to that position insofar as it's a complete denial of any form of providence or meaning, and if it's all matter in motion, then it can be reorganized whichever way you want. the challenge for conservatives, as usual, is you don't want to go so far as to say that every last bit is the result of providence, because then you sap. There's no more sense of self-improvement, or if everything is determined, then you don't have a mobile society. You'd have a static one. So the philosophical halfway house for people on the right is to preserve some sense that there's a meaning imbued in these things, while leaving room to improve upon it. As Locke puts it, nature gives us the almost worthless materials that we inject our labor in. So they're not entirely worthless, they're almost worthless. I don't know how helpful that is as a response, but I think, yeah, it is the problem. Yes, Bob.
I thought your talk was very helpful in bringing out the two different ways of looking at equality of opportunity, the two principal ways now, very helpful indeed. I also thought your comparison of the Declaration with its emphasis on rights with Lincoln, who has a more idealistic, equality-oriented understanding, helps us understand that early on you had an opportunity to make what you can of yourself. Later on, it becomes much more important that one has equality of opportunity. By the way, the notion of opportunity goes with the old Lockean phrase of the pursuit of happiness also. You have equal pursuits. But as you pointed out, the important thing was political rather than social or economic. That too is a big difference. These are just comments and not very organized questions. I would add one thing to your last remark, and that is what's somewhat more obvious than what Providence has in mind for us is the difference between dog and human being. That is those distinctions, because that leads to the notion of what is a good human being, and therefore a notion of some, I don't like this word concrete, some clear meaning of what opportunity is. An opportunity for what? One of our problems now is relativism as to goods, plus equal dignity, somehow derivative in a dim way from Kant. That's why liberals who are aware of goods, nevertheless, are really guilty about insisting that the things that contribute to good lives, especially good families, have to be upheld. So that's one of the problems, that conservatives have a better chance than liberals in understanding the distinctively important things for human beings, and should speak up for that. In fact, and therefore there's a limitation on their devotion to equality, because you push equality too far, as you've indicated, and in fact you ruin good families and such. We should be praising good families, even families like the Bushes that give rise to a succession of decent people and well-educated people.
The Bushes are the Clintons. We keep everything impartial.
Somewhat surprising coming from you.
So, I think I agree that what Ben Bernanke said is irrational and almost insane, on the one hand. On the other hand, I also wonder if it might be good for the elites in our society to subscribe to some form of that irrationality, because there's different alternatives to viewing. So he's a very powerful, intelligent, successful man. So how does he view himself? And his account of himself is he was just extraordinarily lucky. And that gives him some kind of humility and some sense that he owes something to other people. And to that extent, it could be healthy, because the alternative might be, actually, I am a natural ruler. Who cares what Locke says? Clearly, I'm superior and I deserve to rule. And that kind of dynamic can be very dangerous for a society.
I think that's an excellent point. And in fairness to Bernanke, that's what he went on to say in his commencement address. that therefore all of you big shots from Princeton, don't think too highly of yourselves because you really owe it to society to give back to them. So you make a good point. There's a danger, though, on that position, too, where you take it to a certain point and you start teaching people at the lower end that they're not really in control of their lives. And you start to erode, I think, one of the things that is most necessary in the race of life, which is a belief that if you work hard, you can overcome circumstances. And this is the paradox that you then find on the left. So you point out one of the good implications of looking at it this way, but you start to teach people that it's all arbitrary, and then you add on to that the game is rigged, it's the 1%, and so on and so forth. It breeds a form of quietism. You kind of sap the indomitable spirit that you find in certain people. I mean, you mentioned, we talked about Lincoln. Frederick Douglass is one of my absolute favorite Americans. I mean, talk about a story. I mean, Lincoln was born in a log cabin. I mean, Douglass was born a slave. And he has a speech that I really like that he gave in 1862 called, "What shall be done with the slaves if emancipated?" Which I don't need to explain to you is an important question because a lot of people who were opposed to slavery thought, well, what then we do with former slaves? And Douglass's answer is very revealing. He says nothing. Let them vote, let them pray, let them study, let them work. And then he offers the justification for this. He says, the great majority of human duties are of this negative character. If men were born in need of crutches instead of having legs, the fact would be otherwise. And here is someone who I think would have every reason in the world to embrace the politics of resentment and to say that it's not fair and America owes me this and America owes me that. I mean, he was born a slave himself. He's not the descendant of slaves. And he preached this, gospel of, I have legs. He didn't say no one is in need of crutches. He didn't say there are no positive duties. He said the majority of them. So what ends up happening is, I mean, how do you want citizens to think of themselves? I guess is another way to think of this debate on equality of opportunity. What sort of a regime do you want to rule the minds of citizens? Do you want a regime that teaches them that it's just arbitrary forces and that they're playthings of not even of the gods, just of matter in motion, and that it's someone else's job to right the injustices of the birth lottery? Or do you want to drill in them this ethos of, no matter where I was born, I can rise? Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you. So I'm wondering whether we can explain the importance in this country of the equality of opportunities by making reference to the pursuit of happiness. Professor Faulkner has already anticipated the answer, but I would like you to expand on this. So perhaps it is not only the important point is not only the fact that here Marxism has had a much weaker influence, but it is precisely the fact that both the concepts opportunity and pursuit focus on the idea of the process instead of the end result, and so in this they are quite similar. Then I have also a question, a clarification question, which is about the difference between opportunity and life chances. You have made reference during your talk to these two things as different. I'd like you to explain a bit better what you mean, because it seems to me that they are almost the same, but please.
Well, look, an opportunity, that's what I said. The fundamental ambiguity, the problem with the term equality of opportunity is that today it means two sets of different things. One is, are the opportunities available and is everyone allowed to pursue them? Or do you have a regime of nepotism or discrimination that says, left-handed people can't do this, Mormons can't do this, Jews can't do that? But then the other thing it encompasses is, do you have the capacities to seize these opportunities? Do you have what it takes to get the job? So it's one thing to say, anyone can apply for the job. In America they use the term equal opportunity employer. So we're not going to discriminate against you based on any of these arbitrary factors. That said, are we all equally placed to have the skills that are necessary in order to get the job? The equality of life chances starts to look at the fact that even if you achieve equality in that first realm and you eliminate discrimination, you still have vast, they call them background inequalities, that tilt the playing field in the favor of some and against others. And the equality of life chances wants to try to remedy that. Does that make sense?
Now I understand better what you mean. I still think that the terms chance and opportunity are closer, perhaps.
So think of chance as odds.
No, but I have understood. Now,
think of chance
but what about
as
the
odds.
first part of my question regarding pursuit of happiness and opportunity?
So look, what the
Instead
term...
of emphasis on distribution of wealth,
Yeah.
equality in terms of wealth, and
So
in a more European perspective.
yeah. So I think for the founders, the term the pursuit of happiness would have meant, I think first and foremost, liberty of conscience. That the pursuit of happiness is in terms of the duties you have to your maker, and that no one should be allowed to interfere with your pursuit of happiness in the next world by compelling you to attend a particular form of religious service, or forbidding you from attending another, or forcing conversions, or so on and so forth. So if there's one area where you had broad theoretical agreement at the time of the founding, was on the rights of conscience. And that is tied to the pursuit of liberty. Now that's not the only dimension, because ours is not a wholly otherworldly regime. I think the other big component in this world is property rights. That whichever way you choose to pursue happiness, whether you want to be a professor at Harvard, a figure skater, an astronaut, you're going to acquire property along the way, and you're entitled to keep that. And there was even, Jefferson and Hamilton who disagreed about the character of the regime. Should it be an agrarian republic or a commercial republic? You're going to have strong protection for property rights, that whatever you acquire honestly, the fruits of your labor belong to you. To me, I think these would be the two biggest pillars in their minds. And then, of course, various other ones, the freedom to marry who you want and so on and so forth. But I think these would be the two biggest ones, the rights of conscience and the rights of property. Yes, sir.
Just on that last question, semantically, I don't think those handicaps you talked about the ability to take opportunities and make something of them, that's not really opportunity. I mean, I think you could divide a line there and say, opportunity is one thing, those are not. But I wonder, would you just talk briefly about religion? Because you said that woman with the pram in New York was going to Obama rally, and then she would go to church. I'm not so sure about that. In terms of your left and right there, I just factor religion into those two views.
This I'm going off of what Charles Murray has found in his book Coming Apart, in which he looked at white America only, because he didn't want to say, well, he didn't want people to say what you found is because of the racial divide. And counterintuitively, what he found is that the elites are more religious than the lower classes. So he focuses, the terms he uses, I think, are the pursuit of happiness in America is work, faith, family, and community. And that if you want to gauge the strength of a particular culture, you look at the strength of these four institutions or pursuits. And what he found is that for the top 20% of white Americans, these things are they're doing quite well. And if you look at the bottom 30%, 50 years ago, there were very small disparities between the top and the bottom, but the bottom has collapsed in the past 50 years. So they're no longer partaking in these institutions that he thinks are are quite important for the pursuit of happiness, or to allow you to have better odds of success in life.
But isn't what you drew on the board, hasn't that replaced religion for much of the left, whereas it hasn't replaced religion for much of the right?
To some extent, yes. Yeah, to some extent, yes. And then that gets us into the thorny question of the content of religion. and some religions are more traditional and more connected to the way religious people of that faith understood the faith centuries ago. And others, like Reform Judaism, for example, are more about social justice or tikkun olam.
Yeah.
Yes.
You know, I'm in this world you're talking about, and all my fellow parishioners dutifully go to church, give lots of money, and hope that all the money can be used for good causes. And they're going to save their souls with good works, if they have a soul. Not sure, but just to be safe, right? So there, I mean, it's actually, they sort of read these articles that say, you know, your children will do better in life if they have a religious, have a faith. So they have a
Just in
religious
case,
faith.
just in case.
Right.
Yes, sir.
I want to go back to the about if we can send a man to the moon, surely we can, and then pick your social issue. I've heard this since 1969 when we landed on the moon. We can cure poverty, we can have education, we can make the world better.
In my defense, I just said ensure that after 12 years of compulsory schooling, you know how to read or write. So,
But I'm simply saying that I think it's a false comparison. The two have nothing to do with each other. Some things in technology turn out to be easier to do. For example, controlled fusion turns out to be hard to do. If you can send a man to the moon or come up with an electric automobile, does not mean that you can cure poverty. But the second part you said was what you just reinforced here. We look at all the money we've spent and all the effort we've put in for what, over 100 years, the government has been running education, and now you have groups opposing school choice. You asked rhetorically as if couldn't we do it, and I would turn it around. How long does it take until you acknowledge that the theory is fundamentally flawed and doomed to fail?
and what is the theory?
The theory that government, education, or society can make education better, and we can end up, what was here, that after 12 years they can read or write, that education can be run by the government and run effectively. We've tried it for so long. When would you say time to scrap the whole thing?
Well, but I mean, education is a public good. I mean, it's not something that the federal government ought to be involved in. The Constitution makes this quite clear, and it also makes no sense that the government that is farthest removed from the community would be involved in something that is as community-based and bound as education. That said, I don't see why the states, and for that, or more importantly, the local governments, would not be involved in education. I mean, the education is, on the one hand, a responsibility of parents, and that's why we have homeschooling in America, and we defend it. But then the political community cannot be indifferent to the fact that your children are maybe not being educated, because right now they're your kids. One day they're going to be my fellow citizens. So you'd want to have, to me, it's less government versus non-government. It's which level of government and how. And I think no one is on the right is going to defend the argument that we need more federal involvement in education. But why would you want to get the state and local governments out of it completely?
But you said it's failed, and I agree with you, by the way.
Well, what's failed is the system we have. That is, the solution is there's no choice, no competition, that we fund the schools and not the kids. So the big, I mean, Milton Friedman, who cooked up school choice, the idea is you can still spend the money, but you give it to the parents, not to the school. And you introduce competition in a realm that has no competition, with the view that, as something that conservatives and libertarians agree upon, is that more choice and more competition brings down prices and improves quality. So it's the same logic, by the way, in healthcare. So that's what hasn't really been tried. Yes, Anna?
I don't know whether I have more of a comment or more of a question, but...
I prefer comments. It's less work for me.
No, well, it's both, because you've talked about this so much. So we've talked a lot, or you've talked a lot about the government and what the government does. Let me just make it clear that the government is, I don't know how many millions of people in jobs, in administrative, whatever, public service kinds of jobs. So one question I have to you is, in your thinking, how do the left and the right conceive of what, the happiness that comes with a career and so on? What's the what are the decisive factors that make people satisfied? Is it some kind of fame? Is it influence? Is it money? And for this little girl that you were talking about, so would Obama ever say, well, we have a great career for her in some public service government administrative thing that is geared to helping girls like her? Or would that not really be a career worth choosing for most people because, it's not quite as aspirational as being president. There's so many people now who have to be in these jobs that are geared to helping others, does the left conceive of these jobs as something, aspirational and wonderful, or should they just be temporary until everybody is somehow on the same level? What's the idea of happiness in terms of careers?
So I think that, well, look, in a sense, the left and the right are equally bourgeois and have a view of, it's about the debate in DC on equality of opportunity is so you can go to college and get a good job and buy a house. That said, the point you raise is one thing I've noticed that never gets mentioned in Washington is one of the big differences between the left and the right is the left is completely enamored with the idea of the noble. The noble. And that's why they're drawn to nonprofits, public service, right? You're a servant of the public. And that's why there's a distrust of the private sector. So conservatives will say, but do you not realize, all the wonders that come from capitalism? But there's still a certain distaste, I think, that the left feels because the benefits come from people pursuing their self-interest. And I think they find that off-putting, and they're very much drawn to the promise of either self-sacrifice on behalf of others or setting aside your interest and just serving others. And conservatives don't deny that the noble exists, but I think, and libertarians are just more cynical as to what ends up happening in these organizations that claim to be in the service of mankind. And what ends up happening is you find, public sector unions and rather cushy positions, and they're more about serving themselves than serving others. But
what about the military?
Yeah, so the military is... I really don't, the left has kind of a continuum of service. Mm-hmm. And they say, you can either do national service or serve in the military, and there are two forms of service. Yeah, I object to that because the military is more than service, it's sacrifice. You may get killed. If you go do the Peace Corps or you go do, what is it called, Teach for America, yeah, that is a form of service, but you're not risking your life. Yeah.
But that's the noble too, then. So there's the conservatives are interested in the noble.
Yeah, but that's what I said. They're interested in the noble too. You also see it with the family that conservatives have a sense of. I think conservatives are look at the noble on a smaller realm. And they're more doubtful of grandiose claims of sacrificing on behalf of the whole of humanity rather than your own.
Mm-hmm. So, but then there is this confusion in terms of this little girl that on the one hand, she should be able to be anything that she wants to be. But on the other hand, there is this idea that really the jobs you should aspire to are jobs that would help the little girl. So the little girl, we celebrate her as wanting to be, CEO, but on the other hand, we helped you out. It took like 500 people to get you out of your spot, so you better enter, the machine where you help others.
But the other thing they do too is they repackage the private sector as being about changing the world. I don't know if you watch the television show Silicon Valley. It's actually quite funny. I don't know what Silicon Valley is like. But my friends who are there tell me that it's actually the way they talk. No one is there to make money. Everyone is there to change the world and build a better planet. Now, in the course of doing so, they make obscene amounts of money. But they get, if you want, to live with themselves because the self-understanding is, I'm not a capitalist, I'm not pursuing my interest, I'm not trying to make money, there's no greed in me. It's all a form of service to humanity by inventing Yik Yak, for example, which is really a great boon to mankind. I thought you had your hand up, sir?
Yeah, I did. It's interesting that you mentioned Ben Bernanke's commencement address. Drew Faust at Harvard actually made the same argument.
Could you speak a little
Who did?
louder for us listeners?
Sorry. Drew Faust, the president of Harvard, made the same argument, I think, a year later. So it's interesting to know that Bernanke said the same thing the year before. It seems that we've talked a lot about intelligence and how that this seems to cut against the idea of natural equality. But could you say that equal opportunity means that people with equal capabilities deserve equal outcomes? So everybody who has a 120 IQ, if you're using IQ as the indicator of natural capability for whatever purposes, all people who start on that same level would end at the same level as well.
But why would you reduce natural capability to IQ? I mean, I don't know much about this and the science and the debates behind it, but it seems to me it's probably one component of it. But you can have a high IQ and bad character, and you can have a low IQ and good character. So there's a reductive tendency amongst the IQ folks to kind of reduce a human being to that number.
Right, but I mean, it's probably the best indicator for certain types of outcomes. I mean, athletic ability is, the best predictor of being in the NBA, for example. I mean, so yeah, there's a constellation, but if you take a certain basket of capabilities relevant to a certain type of outcome that you're trying to achieve, you should be able to see some correlation.
Okay, but so let me...
The other thing that I think is interesting about what you've said is that you seem to take naturally occurring capabilities as being a basket of things that come not out of just creation, but also out of sort of your formation once you've been born. So we would say maybe that IQ or athletic ability are more genetic than other sorts of capabilities, but maybe your character or your work ethic or your mindset are more based on your formation from your family. But you seem to, I would resist the idea that those are as natural, but you seem to treat those as natural from the practical perspective of how much we expect people's outcomes to be equal.
No, I don't. I err on the side of more malleability. And I think the regime, culture, the family upbringing can do wonders with the natural given. So I have less of a, look, I can't give you precise percentages. People in Washington, D.C. do that. This is one of the things that keeps them busy. 42.3% of your life outcomes are your genes, 11% is your parents, 5% is the ping pong club you go to on weekends. I think this is nonsense. I don't know what the proportions are. I mean, clearly it's a mixture of the two, but I would err more heavily on the ability to do more with even a little natural given with a good regime.
But you seem to think that if a family or an upbringing negatively impacts someone, then you can say, I'm sorry, your family was bad, you were born in complete poverty, and therefore these outcomes aren't going to be available to you, which I think is more controversial than saying you have an IQ of 70, you're not going to be the president.
But I'm not saying these outcomes won't be available to you. I'm saying there are limits. I mean, you're not going to have as good odds in life as someone who was born into better circumstances, but I'm not indifferent to the circumstances of your birth, and I'm open to having a conversation as to what we can do to, like I said, think of it in terms of a threshold. What can we give you to some extent, to compensate for the unfortunate circumstances you were born in, but not to bring you at the same level as others.
I would just add to that, there's the element of almost luck. Zuckerberg didn't derive Facebook out of deep intellectual thought and talking to Harvard professors. It just sort of bumped into it, starting with a few computers. Whoever invented the pet rock, right, made a fortune with it. So there's an example, I suppose, of one guy with a 120 IQ does a lot better than somebody who didn't invent the pet rock. And to try to somehow, if not legislate them, that somehow maneuver them out of existence, I think it's a fool's errand with terrible consequences because it leads to all those guys that you're mentioning in Washington trying to figure out how it works. And that's where you end up with the 11% with a ping pong club, although maybe I got the percentage wrong. And so, that's the problem, I think, that there are too many people who are trying to solve a problem that I don't think is solvable. We talked about Lincoln, but the examples that come to my mind are Einstein and Beethoven. I mean, there's just no way of somehow factoring those kinds of examples. And those two men influence civilization and our lives much more so than anything else you can do. And it seems to be just the genetic luck of the draw.
But my point is, I don't care about the ones that are succeeding immensely. I mean, if they earn their success, let them keep it. What I'm saying is we can't be indifferent to those who are born into difficult circumstances. So I think the approach on the right is you don't worry about Beethoven and Einstein. You do worry about the little girl born into the bleakest poverty, but then the question is, what do you promise her? And that's where I'm not willing to go as far as the left. But I also don't think we can be indifferent to that.
And I guarantee you that there is never a place you can draw the line. Once you unleash the forces of people who would want to adjust and control and advance, they will never be satisfied because there is no line of demarcation. And therefore, it will always slide to endless bureaucracy and greater
So that's a valid point. Yeah, there's no real limiting principle. But it ends up being a prudential call. But the promises of the left are always more seductive. But I mean, look, this is one of, I think, of the drawbacks of living in a democratic regime is that that statement that we shall all have the same chance to succeed in life, I think instinctively resonates with many people, and they don't think there's anything wrong with that. Of course, they don't want eugenics or to abolish the family, but they think, yeah, this is what America means. So the difficult job is for us to, to be the skunks at the garden party who say, actually, well, no, that's not possible. It's a very hard sell. The other side's promises are always more appealing.
Just feel bad for the person that's born a skunk.
But this raises the question as to what's really going on here. And as I recall de Tocqueville's, he said that the reformers always wanted to do well for everybody. They were high-minded, but they had to have power in order to do these good things for everybody. And not only did they have to have power, but they had to have centralized power so they could do good for everybody. So isn't the essential drive here the drive for power?
Yes.
So you can impose good things on the society, and this equality of opportunity defined as equality across groups, just a tool for this larger objective, as I think you suggested early on.
Well, I'll repeat to you what I told this gentleman, that I think you can arrive at these positions by raising reasonable questions, and I'm willing to be generous with my opponents in terms of their motives and not necessarily ascribe bad motives to them.
But look at Silicon Valley. There you question, they were making your term obscene amounts of money while cloaking themselves in doing good for humanity.
But they believe it.
Yes, and the people on the left believe it too, that they're really acquiring all this power because they want to help the less fortunate.
Yeah.
They believe it, but that doesn't mean we have to believe it.
No, but I mean, it also means that their motivations, meaning if this is their self-understanding, you could say they're mistaken, but it would mean that there's no malice, that this is what they think they're doing. So to be mistaken is not a moral, it's an intellectual error, it's not a moral error.
I think with this invocation of chance, we should call these proceedings to a halt, and thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
This is the program on constitutional government, and our speaker today is David Azerrad. David Azerrad is, well, you would be a professor of political philosophy if you didn't hold the opinions you hold. but he has a position at the Heritage Foundation, where he is the director of the Kenneth Simon Center for Principles and Politics. At the Heritage, he does policy and theory, whether policy for the sake of theory or theory for the sake of policy, let's not ask. His writings have appeared in various publications, most of them with a conservative cast: the Weekly Standard, National Affairs, First Things, the Times of London. That's different. Real Clear Politics, and so on. He's a Canadian, and he graduated from Concordia University in Montreal, and then got his PhD at the University of Dallas, where he wrote a dissertation on the foundations of John Locke's political thought. And he also teaches a course on conservatism or conservative political thought at American University in Washington. Mm-hmm. So David Azerrad.
Thank you, Harvey.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. Whenever I teach the Declaration of Independence, I always ask my students, what did Jefferson mean when he said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal"? And I can usually bet that regardless of where the students come from, whatever their background is, invariably the answer is going to be some variation on equality of opportunity. Now, I find that amusing. So if we were to use what I consider the awful race of life analogy, and we can talk about that later, why it's a bad idea to think of life as a race, the first realm is going to govern the rules of the race, and then the other dimension is going to look at the training that the runners receive to compete fairly in that race. So if you wanted to equalize opportunities in the first realm, you would eliminate discrimination in hiring and ensure that positions are awarded on the basis of merit. But if you wanted to equalize opportunities in the second realm, you would need to look at the so-called birth lottery to see what is the training that the runners receive in the race. So if you take up, this is why I find this issue interesting, the rather hackneyed idea of equality of opportunity, you're rapidly led to some, I think, profound philosophical questions. In thinking through equality of opportunity, you need to confront the question of how fair is life? How fair should it be? What does life owe us? And when life doesn't meet our expectations, what do we owe one another? And I think this is one of the deepest disagreements you'll find between the left and the right today in America. It doesn't bubble up all the time in our public debates in the public square. We tend to disagree about the size of government and what to do about the economy. But I've found that lurking behind many of these disputes is this question: how equal should opportunities be? Which is the question I propose to discuss with you today. Now, before I address it, I need to take up an objection. If there are any conservatives in the room, surely you will tell me, aha, you claim that everyone agrees about equality of opportunity. That is nonsense. Everyone knows that liberals hate equality of opportunity, and what they really want to do is equality of results. Now, this is one of the most tired talking points on the right. Every single function, how do you know that we've eliminated discrimination? And the answer that many of them then offer is a rather simple one. They say, look, when so-called historically marginalized groups are proportionally represented in all of the good areas of life, and then I may add, not overrepresented in the bad areas of life. This, they'll say, is a common sense notion. So if you look at the various identity groups that the left keeps track of, here are women, here are LGBTQs, Hispanics, African Americans. Arab is now a new push, so there's a push to include Arab Americans in the census so we can keep track of them. Here's their distribution in the policy, in the population. When you look at the boardroom, when you look at Congress, when you look at the detention hall, when you look at the prison courtyard, there should be some sort of rough approximation of the percentages of these various groups, both marginalizing and marginalized, in these various areas of life. So the rich, diverse tapestry of American life should be reflected in all of the various areas. So what they're in effect saying is, the way you measure equality of opportunity, the way you determine that you actually do have equality of opportunity for all these groups, is if you see it reflected in outcomes. So it's not embracing equality of results as an end unto itself. It's arguing that equality of results is the true measure of equality of opportunity. It's the only way to prove that you've eliminated discrimination. And then how do you go about doing this? On the whole, the left seems to be more interested in challenging the selection criteria, this will be the selection criteria, by which these various groups, because the word equality of opportunity never appears in the Declaration of Independence. It doesn't appear in the Constitution. It doesn't appear anywhere in any of the state constitutions. And if you plow through the voluminous writings of Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton, or any other founder for that matter, nowhere will the term appear. In fact, the term was only coined in the late 19th century. But I think it's a testimony to the power that the idea of equality of opportunity holds over the American mind, that my students, like the rest of us for that matter, understand America, and the founding for that matter, in terms of equality of opportunity. It is, I think, the most cherished term in our political lexicon. I mean, one simple way to verify this is listen to politicians talk about it. They all sound the same. Democrats and Republicans, the script is interchangeable. Even in this election, and I don't think one could say this about many issues, Donald Trump sounds like Hillary Clinton when he talks about equality of opportunity. It's not just the politicians. 95% of Americans agree with the following proposition. Everyone in America should have an equal opportunity to get ahead. I think it's very hard to find any other issue on which we're in near universal agreement as a people. Now, part of the reason, of course, that we all love equality of opportunity and all agree with the proposition is that it's an elastic term into which you can pretty much read whatever you want. So equality of opportunity will mean one thing to conservatives, another thing to liberals, and yet another to libertarians. The protean nature of the term basically stems from the fact that it encompasses two distinct ideas. The first one has to do with the availability of opportunities, and the other one with the capacities to seize them, and if you want, convert them into accomplishments. A raising letter I get from a conservative organization assures me that liberals don't believe in equality of opportunity and they want to give us equality of results. Now, this is clearly not true if you look at individuals. The left is very concerned with income inequality. I don't know of anyone who is arguing for income equality, who is arguing that everyone should earn the same amount. That said, if you look at groups, and I think one could argue that the left today is as interested, if not more interested, in identity politics and group outcomes than it is in individual autonomy and individual outcomes. This is where this issue of equality of results shows up. Allow me to explain how you get there. So equality of opportunity demands that we award positions in the public and in the private sector based on merit. So the government needs to step in to eliminate discrimination in the areas that are most closely related with getting ahead in life, like college admissions or jobs, to make sure that businesses, employers, and universities are not discriminating. Fair enough, you'll say. But then the left raises a question that I think is quite reasonable. They'll say, okay, but how do you know that in spite of the best anti-discrimination legislation, other forms of covert discrimination don't continue to exist? So Ruth Bader Ginsburg, for example, in her dissent in the Supreme Court decision Ricci v. DiStefano, said that, look, the Title VII of the '64 Civil Rights Act got rid of overt race-based discrimination, but it didn't usher in, quote, genuinely equal opportunity. More subtle and sometimes unconscious forms of discrimination replaced once undisguised restrictions. So the left asks, I think, this very reasonable question.